The Heavy and the Heavy Edit are middleweight Splatlings that boast impressive DPS and slaying potential. Given the similarities between these two weapons, I've chosen to cover them together. Whilst they have some key differences, they are both strong, reliable, and fit similar roles within teams. And whilst the Heavy has been in the Splatoon series since 2015, the Heavy Edit is a much newer addition, being released in 2023 in Splatoon 3. Let's discuss how to get the most out of these weapons in SalmonRun. Stats. Both the Heavy and the Edit have a set base damage of 35, which is the same for all Splatlings. In addition, the fall off damage will do a minimum of 25, and they both will start recovering ink after 40 frames. They both also have elements of shot RNG when firing, which substantially increases when jumping. Neither can store their charges, and neither can recharge whilst firing. That is where the technical similarities end. The Heavy Splatling has longer range than the Edit, with it being the third longest range Splatling currently in the game. It takes 48 frames to charge to the first circle and 72 frames to fully charge the weapon, which is about 1.2 seconds. This was recently updated in a patch in March 2025. When fully charged, the Heavy fires for 160 frames, which is roughly 2.6 seconds. When firing continuously, it fires every 4 frames, which is equivalent to 15 shots per second. There is no change to the damage or fire rate of the Heavy Splatling when fully charged, so partially charging and fully charging have the same outcomes, except for the time spent and ink used. You get 4 full charges per ink tank, and after throwing a bomb, you'll have 1 full charge left. The Edit has shorter range, being the second shortest Splatling currently in the game, only outranging the Mini. It also has longer charge times when compared to the Heavy, taking 60 frames to reach the first circle and another 60 frames to fully charge. This is equivalent to 2 seconds. When charged to the first circle, the Edit will fire for 120 frames, which is 2 seconds. When fully charged, the Edit will fire for 180 frames, which is 3 seconds. When not fully charged, it fires at 4 frames per second, which is standard across the Splatling class. When fully charged, the Edit's fire rate changes. It increases from 4 frames to 3 frames per shot, which is then equivalent to 20 shots per second. This makes it the fastest Splatling currently in the game, with the only comparison being to the ballpoint short-range fire mode. This also increases its total damage output, but I'll speak more about that at the end of the video. You get 5 full charges per full ink tank, and after throwing a bomb, you'll have just over 1 full charge left. The other key difference between the Heavy and the Edit is the mobility when charging and firing. The Heavy is slightly slower, whereas the Edit has the same mobility stats as the Mini Splatling, making it feel really fluid and free with movement. You pay for this with slower charge times, but I think it's a good exchange. You can make swifter exits but also continue firing whilst backing away. With the Heavy, you'll need to remember to create a bit more space between yourself and the enemies, but you have the longer range to do that. Bomb throwing for both weapons isn't really encouraged. The ink usage is high, and not being able to charge the weapons quickly leaves you vulnerable. For the right bosses, you'll need them, but for everything else, the Heavy and the Edit don't see much value in them. Boss slaying. Both the Heavy and the Edit are extremely proficient at slaying and don't really struggle with any boss individually. What you may find you struggle with is not being able to move or recover ink safely. Therefore, taking aggressive positions early will likely help you out later on in the wave. For steelheads, drizzlers, slamming lids and steel eels, you can one-cycle them and independently manage them. Scrappers in large quantities can prove annoying, so it's best to ensure they don't all gang up on you at once. The same can be said for flipper floppers, as you can be caught off guard if you're not in a good position. Both the Heavy and the Edit can take down floppers from full health in the air. Given the range of both weapons, enemies like stingers and fish sticks can be taken down with ease. Bomb heavy spawns are where you may struggle. Multiple Maws can be annoying, but multiple flyfish can prove game-ending. In conjunction with stingers, big shots and slamming lids, you'll struggle to charge either weapon. You'll want to prevent this from happening, but when it does, special use is the way to go. The main thing to keep in mind with both the Heavy and the Edit is the fact that you have to spend time and space and ink charging your weapon. If you allow spawns to populate the field for too long, you'll risk not being able to safely use either weapon. Lessers can become problematic for the Heavy and the Edit. You'll want to manage these consistently throughout waves to ensure that you don't find yourself in a position where they can interfere with your charge cycles or your safety. Though you don't have any AoE spread, you do have fast fire rate and power. Lessers are just as important as any boss when you're given a Splatling. To ignore them is to risk your safety later on in the wave. King waves are fun for both the Heavy and the Edit. In short, you should be focusing on the Kings primarily, as your continued DPS is great for damaging them. I often find that the damage capable with these weapons outweigh the damage of most specials. Therefore, I tend to use specials liberally to refill my ink tank and stay productive. With the exception of the crab tank, I would consider using specials anytime I felt threatened by space or enemies. Night waves can be hit and miss. For rush, you'll likely need support from non-charging weapons to cover you when you charge, but you are strong enough to manage the rush of enemies. Just ensure you keep an eye on target switches so you're prepared for when it switches to you. For grillers, both weapons are very powerful for stunning and defeating them. You'll want to prioritise this because in some comps you may have the most overall DPS of any weapon, and without you, your team may struggle to defeat them. In addition, you've got range to stun them early or from a protected space. If your teammate has a Heavy or an Edit, do your best to protect them from the small fry. Seeking is a lot of fun with both weapons, and Mothership allows you to use your range. For all the other night waves, see what your comp is lacking and try to fill in the gaps. Sometimes they'll need DPS, but other times you may just need to run eggs, which isn't ideal for these weapons, but objectives always outweigh weapon rolls. Weapon rolls. For most situations, the Heavy and the Edit will take similar roles in comps. They both have mid to long range, extended firing time and respectable damage. The downside to being a Splatling is that you're always forced to tread a bit more carefully and spend time charging, so you'll likely find yourself defaulting to a more defensive position, similar to how you see Splatlings play in PvP. But I want to challenge you to stop instinctively doing this. Firstly, because there is no base, and secondly, what are you defending exactly? Both weapons have amazing firepower, range and total damage, so opting to stand back and being too careful means that you may actually underuse this weapon. Sure, SalmonRun is SalmonRun, and I know you're probably like, hey, it's kind of crazy sometimes and I have to play safe and all my randos are dead and it's just me alive, and you know what? I encourage that, and I think if you're newer or less experienced with the mode and the weapons, then it's best to be cautious. However, SalmonRun is a timed mode. You only have 100 seconds to fulfill a certain quota and make it out alive. When you play defensively, you give up time and allow enemies to take more space on the map. I promise you, you will get so much more out of both weapons when you utilise their powerful ability to slay. They aren't meant to be supportive weapons in SalmonRun, but I often notice players using them more supportively because, hey, isn't that what we do in PvP, right? I mean, that's a conversation for a more qualified person, but I wouldn't necessarily say that roles within comps translate from PvP to PvE without any noticeable changes. The main change for us in SalmonRun is that we have to constantly and consistently apply pressure and damage to high HP enemies. Stealth, retreating and returning to base just aren't really a thing in SalmonRun. Any time spent not damaging enemies has the potential to backfire for you. You're more fluid with movement, less restricted in how you achieve goals, and you have the powerful advantage of going against computer enemies, so everything is set in its way. The Heavy and the Edit are both really powerful slayers, and you'll want to be aggressive with them in the first instance. Oftentimes with weapons that have noticeable disadvantages, and in this case it's the charge times, you'll need to be more proactive so as to guarantee safety and objective. Slaying things earlier to protect yourself is never a bad thing. You can't pierce, you have no AoE spread, you have to spend a second here and a second there charging, and your ink tank isn't as great as other weapons. So don't sit back and wait for enemies to find you. You need to go out there and make sure you're always on top of the incoming hordes of enemies. A notable difference between the Heavy and the Edit is the way that the game allocates them in SalmonRun comps. The Heavy has always been classed as long range and will take the 4th slot, which is usually designated for long range weapons. However, the Edit isn't, and it's classed as middle range, so will usually take the 3rd slot. This means it has appeared less often and is also paired with a long range weapon. So oftentimes you'll find that the Edit is paired with a weapon with just as much range, if not more. This is is why the edit has been featured with other charging weapons like the E-liter and the Tri-Stringer, and other long-range weapons like the Jet Squelcher or the Rapid Pro. This potentially causes overlaps with roles within a squad, so if that's the case, figure out what the edit does better than that fourth weapon, and vice versa. For the heavy, you'll likely have the most range in any comp, so don't forget that. Charge cycles. With the regular Heavy Splatling, there is no penalty or disadvantage for not fully charging the weapon or cancelling your charges before they are finished. Whether you half charge it or fully charge it, the damage and the fire rate remain the same. The only difference is time spent charging, time spent firing, and the amount of ink you use. What makes the Heavy Splatling so solid in most comps is how useful it is regardless of how much you can charge it. As long as you're able to efficiently manage your ink tank and positioning on the map, you kind of have a bit more flexibility than most other Splatlings in how you use it. With the edit, it's not as simple. You're incentivized to fully charge the weapon in almost every situation to maximize the buff it gets to its fire rate. For comparison, with a partial charge, its DPS, which is its damage per second, is 525. When fully charged, it is 700. This matches the ballpoint short range mode and is only second to the Hydra, so given the choice, you'll likely want to fully charge it more often than not, right? Well, it isn't that simple, and that's partly due to the fact that SalmonRun as a whole is quite punishing to weapons that have to charge. You're always spending time charging, which leaves you vulnerable to damage, and just the general chaos of SalmonRun. So anytime you're pressured into not fully charging the weapon, you may feel like the edit is underwhelming, but I still think it packs a decent punch with partial charges. When charged up to 99% charge, the edit will fire for approximately 4 seconds. It fires the same amount of shots when fully charged, but it just does it quicker, which is why at full charge it fires for 3 seconds in total. Sometimes you may want that slower fire rate. Notable instances where you actually don't want to fully charge the edit are few, but they do exist. The first is against fish sticks. The fully charged fire rate is actually slightly too fast for the speed of the fish sticks, so it might be more efficient to only charge halfway, thereby giving you a slightly slower fire rate to match their speed. The other instance I can recommend not fully charging the edit is during rush waves. Of course, you're a bit more at risk of getting hurt just because of splatling things, but utilising half charges here means that you don't spend time fully charging and means your fire rate isn't too fast to catch the lines of Chum. Chum only have 50 HP in rush, so you need 2 hits to defeat them, but at full charge with the edit, you may find you'll waste shots as the shots will move faster than you can defeat the Chum. Partial and half charges are fine here and may help you with things like positioning, ink efficiency and survivability. With the full charges, you ideally want to use them when you have bulky enemies to shred through, such as Cohocks, Big Shots, Moors, Flipper Floppers and the Kings. Otherwise, half and partial charges can do enough damage and give you a bit more freedom with repositioning and ink management. I think it's worth mentioning that regardless of how you manage your charges with the heavy and the edit, it is important to get used to the way they function at half and full charges. They have notable differences, but a lot of the time your role and position within a comp in SalmonRun will be similar. The edit can shred through high HP enemies quickly, but the heavy has more flexibility to half charge and relocate with a bit more ease. I think it's important to recognise the differences so you can maximise their respective strengths, but I will say the reason I chose to cover them both together is that for most situations in SalmonRun, especially in freelance, I use them almost identically. I hope this video helps you appreciate both the heavy and the Heavy Edit Splatlings a little bit more. I'll catch you guys soon.